Hi everybody, and welcome back to the Every Stitch Counts podcast. Hello. Thank you so much for stopping by and tuning back in for another episode. If you're new here, my name is Charlotte and I love to knit. And so on this channel, we talk about all things knitting, all my highs and lows, projects that I've been working on, things that I've made, and I like to really share my honest opinions and some of the tips and tricks that I've learned from other people, but also just discovered for myself with all of you. I live in the Seattle, Washington area. In this week's episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that really puzzles a lot of people, especially people who are new to knitting, and it definitely has been something that puzzles me and has puzzled me in the past, but I think through my own research, my own experience, I've gained a good grasp about some of the tips and tricks and general rules of thumbs that you can use when selecting yarn for your patterns. A big issue that I hear people running into all the time is they've picked a pattern and then the yarn that they selected for that pattern just does not work well together, and it results in a product that they don't wear, they don't like, and it just doesn't work for what they wanted, and it doesn't match the vision that they had for that product. So today we are going to be talking about that. This is going to be the kickoff of a 3-part series that I'm going to be starting, all about how to set yourself up for success when knitting and preparing to make a garment that you hopefully want to wear. Success to me is just that. I get something at the end of the project that I love to wear, I feel comfortable in, and really brings out the features of the design, but also of me, and works well for my skin tone and my coloring, and I just feel really comfortable in it. If you haven't done so already, please give this video a like, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to this channel. Commenting and interacting with the video really helps me out and helps the YouTube algorithm out, and it's always great conversation on these videos, so leave your comment and experience below at any part of this video that is interesting to you, and I will be sure to read it and reply to as many as I can. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Especially for new knitters, people that don't have as much experience selecting and knowing what kinds of yarn will give what kind of effects, it can be a really overwhelming and daunting task to select a yarn for a pattern and know that you're going to be happy with the finished product. So in this video, I'm going to break down the tips and tricks, the basic understanding of yarn and the types of yarn that you'll run into, what effects they will generally give, and some of the tips and tricks and rules of thumb, if you will, that I use myself when selecting yarns for my projects. Just to disclaim for everyone watching, this is in no way a set of cardinal rules. It is inherently somewhat subjective, and there's always going to be exceptions to the rules. Things I'm going to be talking about in this video are generalizations and things that have worked for me, and there are people and resources who are far more knowledgeable to a detailed, deep level than I am that I will talk about and give to you all at the end of this video. For me, there are 3 main categories of decisions that you need to be thinking about in order to set yourself up for as close to success as possible when preparing to start a project. Those 3 things are the yarn that you choose, so the actual material that you're using to create the fabric, the color of that yarn, the color that is going to sit next to your skin, next to your face, and in combination with one another if you're doing color work, and then the fit of the garment. So this would mean all of the modifications that you might do to make it fit and suit your body type the way that you want. This video is only going to be covering picking the actual material and yarn itself. We'll cover the other 2 subjects in future videos. For me, the most important first step that you should always try to take a moment to think about is your vision for that garment. You might be asking yourself, well, what does it mean to have a vision for a finished garment? Oftentimes when I'm looking at patterns, I'm seeing elements or design features of that pattern that I really like, and sometimes I will like the entire pattern as is and there's nothing I would want to change about it, but there are often times where I see certain parts that I like and certain things that I don't like so much. Even if you want to make something that purely matches pretty close to what you're seeing in the design photos, there are always going to be elements of that fabric and how that material is going to feel on your body that you can name. I think it's really, really important to step outside of the knitting world for a moment when doing this and then think about your closet. Think about the other sweaters you've made or sweaters you've worn, and think about the things that you like and put names to them. Some of the examples of these types of traits that you can name are listed on the side here, but just to name a few of them, it would be softness of the fabric, it would be the density of the weave, the looseness of the weave, how structured and stiff the material is. These are all things that you can name and call out as you're thinking about picking the material base for whatever design you happen to be making. This is really powerful because if you can identify certain traits that you want this particular sweater to have, you can then eliminate actually a pretty huge percentage of the yarns that would be available to you. For example, let's say I'm making this crew neck sweater and I know I want it to be very soft, have a bit of durability. I don't want it to be prone to pilling, and I want it to have some drape, but I also want it to be able to retain its shape. I don't want it to just be like a heavy linen that is going to retain no shape at all. I want it to have a little bit of structure, but not too much. Those are all very specific things that I can now put into my brain and use to identify, well, what yarn is going to give me those effects. I think knowing what you like is actually by far the most powerful tool that you can develop in your knitting and anything you make, really. You're always going to try things and there's always going to be a learning experience along the way, but knowing what you like can give you a smaller base of material that you're going to choose from for that pattern, and it can really help narrow down a very overwhelming decision, because sometimes we just get decision paralysis and there's too many yarns that are options for what we want to make. Once you have a vision and you've been able to identify, 2 to 4 elements of your fabric that you want, now all you need is a basic understanding of the kind of yarn and kind of materials that will give you some of these different effects. And the best way to understand that is to really have a basic rudimentary understanding of how fiber is made, what it's made of, and what elements of those fibers and yarns will give you any of these outcomes. So what gives me drape? What gives me structure in a yarn? What gives me durability? What will decrease the likelihood of pilling? These are all things that we can start to match up when we have a basic understanding of fiber, how it's made, and how it's processed together. Easy. Now, talking about fiber material and all of the different kinds of fiber that there are is something that I could never possibly begin to tackle in one video. I'm not even an expert in all of those fabrics, but the most important thing to know is actually pretty simple. You want to know in general the kind of fibers that you're dealing with. So if we were to categorize them into 3 different buckets, on the top we would have our wools. This is primarily going to be sheep's wool and alpaca. That's one whole bucket. Underneath that, we would have our plant-based fibers. This is going to be your silks, your linen, your cottons, bamboos, things that are not animal-based. And then underneath that, which is going to be the smallest bucket, these are going to be our man-made fibers. So your elastans and the nylons that are added to yarns for various reasons. In general, it's important to understand the kind of characteristics the yarns in these different buckets are likely to have. So if we think about wool, for example, we can say with a high degree of certainty that most wools are going to have an element of elasticity in their structure. So they're going to stretch and then return back to their original shape. They're going to be lighter and tend to have more bounce than a plant-based fiber. So they may not be as dense. You can get a bigger gauge without as much weight to the actual yarn. Wool can be either very weak and not durable, or it can be very strong and very ropey and durable. It all depends on how it's spun. When we're talking about wool, I think it's much more important to know about the spin and how spin impacts fabric than the actual material itself. Of course, there's going to be a lot of variation in the softness of different wools based on the breed of the sheep, the origin, how it's processed. There's too many different variables to try to talk about it all in one video. But the important thing to know is wool tends to be lightweight, it tends to be more elastic, it's not as dense and it can really have a wide range of effects in terms of how it's spun. The spinning is really important. When we talk about plant fibers, in general, we can understand that they are inelastic, they don't have stretch, they are much denser typically than animal-based fibers, and they don't bloom as much because of that density. So they typically are drapier because they are denser, and this means that they will typically have more drape. They will be less likely to pill because they're not fluffy. They're very tightly wound and spun, although some can pill. There's always going to be a risk of pilling with handmade garments. And they typically are stronger fibers. So they typically are spun in a way to where they're ropier and they have more strength, making them a very durable element to add to your knitting. Again, these are generalizations. This is not always true, and these are not cardinal rules, and there's always going to be exceptions to these rules, but these are generalizations that you can understand about these two kinds of fibers. And then man-made fibers are really not something that I think too much about, but in general the big ones are nylon and elastin. Nylon is something that's found in sock yarn. It's got no stretch and it provides a lot of stability and durability, which is why it's blended with wools in sock yarn, because they're taking a lot of wear and tear. And so that can be really helpful when you're needing to add durability to a fiber. What's actually really important when selecting a fiber is how that fiber is put together in a spin. There are 3 big buckets that we can put and use to categorize different yarns within spinning styles. And those are going to be woolen spun, worsted spun, and then the amount of plies, so the amount of individual threads within each of those any given yarns. Woolen spun yarns are made with shorter fibers that are pointing in all different directions. They tend to have more air within them because they're not brushed all in the same direction. So the resulting fabric made from woolen spun yarns is very warm. It's typically lighter. It typically has structure to it because of the air quality in it and the lightness to it. It doesn't have as much drape as, say, a worsted spun yarn where the fiber is much denser. Woolen spun fabrics can tend to be very bouncy. They can bloom a lot and really stretch and fill out a stitch. They can change quite a bit from when you're just knitting them to post blocking and washing. These fabrics tend to be a bit less durable than worsted spun yarns because, again, the fibers are all pointing in different directions, and so they're not quite as strong as they would be if they were all working together in the same direction to provide strength and durability. Woolen spun yarns can also sometimes have a more likelihood of pilling, again because more fibers are sticking out, and that can catch and ball up on its own, and it can result in potentially more pilling. Not always, but potentially. Worsted spun yarns are pretty much the exact opposite. All the fibers making those yarns are all facing the same way. The fibers themselves typically are longer, and they are spun in a way to where they are denser, and they're much stronger because all the fibers are longer and working together in the same direction. This is why worsted spun yarns tend to be denser, they tend to be smoother, and they are ones that provide great stitch definition because there's no hairs or fibers or anything sticking out in different directions. They're not as fluffy. Something that can affect both of these types of yarns is the number of plies within any given fiber. You can have yarns that are single ply, so just one strand of yarn, or you can have it up to like 12 different plies. There's really no limit on the number of plies that you can have. Typically yarns will be anywhere from 1 to 6 to 8. Most of your standard worsted spun yarns in the store are going to be 2 to 4 plies. Plies are really interesting because plies also add strength and durability to a yarn. So for example, you can have a worsted spun yarn that has 6 different plies in it, making it a very strong and durable fiber, versus a worsted spun yarn that is maybe only single ply. Those are all things that you kind of have to think about and balance when picking a yarn. In general though, the more plies, the denser the fabric, the more durable the fabric is going to be, and the less likely it's going to pill. Also, in general, the fewer the plies are, the lighter and airier the fabric's going to be, and the less durable it's going to be. So, quick recap. You have your wools, you have your plant fibers, and then you have man-made materials. Within all of those categories, you really only have two ways of spinning fiber: woolen spun, worsted spun. Woolen spun, fibers are all pointing in different directions. They're lighter, they're airier, they don't have as great of stitch definition, and they tend to have less drape, more structure, and to be a little bit less durable. Worsted spun yarns are pretty much the exact opposite in general. They are denser, they're stronger and ropier, have more durability. They are great for stitch definition and not so great for adding a lot of structure to a garment. They typically are drapier and have less structure because of the density and the tightness of the weave. There's more physical weight pulling the material down from your body. Moving on from that information, another element of these yarns is how tightly it's spun. So this is the actual twist and amount of twist that you have in any given yarn. Woolen spun yarns can have a firm or soft degree of spin, and worsted spun yarns can have a firm or soft degree of twist. What this means is the amount of twist that you add to a fiber can be applied to either spin method. There's no general rule there. What's important to understand about that is the effects that that spin gives you. So in general, the lighter the spin, the less durable, the more likely it is to pill, the airier it's going to be, the less structure it's going to have, and the not best stitch definition that you might get from that fabric. The tighter or the firmer the twist, the stronger that yarn is going to be. It's going to probably be less soft. It's going to have a high degree of drapiness, and it will be very durable because it doesn't have a ton of fibers that are potentially getting caught on things. It's very tightly wound together, creating a lot of strength on its own. And then that coupled with it being woven together in all these different ways, it's very durable. So hopefully this gives you a basic understanding of like what the heck is even out there. This is kind of useless information if you don't have a way to visualize what it actually means and how it can actually be applied. So the next part of this is going to be me going through 3 different sweaters where I have pulled in different yarns to bring in different effects to my final fabric. And they are things that I use to deviate from the actual yarn that was used in the original pattern. So hopefully by going through this process and me talking about some of these sweaters individually, you'll be able to get a grasp for how you can start taking some of this information and putting it to use, because it's kind of pointless if you can't do that. The first sweater that I'm going to talk about is my Fieltor light sweater. Now the original pattern was designed in Letlopi, and it is a woolen spun yarn, single ply, but has relatively long fibers, and it's made from a sheep breed that has very coarse, very long stapled length. So what I know about this fabric, based on just looking at it, is I can feel that it's pretty coarse. Okay, if it's coarse, it's going to have a low degree of pilling. It's going to be very light and airy when I wash it. It will have a high degree of bloom to it because the fiber itself isn't twisted very much. It's like barely twisted, but it's pretty durable. And because the staple length of that yarn fiber is very long, once it is knitted together and crossed over each other, that's going to create a lot of added durability to it. So even though the original yarn used for that pattern was a worsted spun yarn that typically is a weaker fiber that isn't super durable, in this instance I can see and identify that this will be a pretty durable, well-wearing, long-lasting, non-pilly sweater. I didn't want to use Letlopi because it was scratchy. And I also had other yarn that I was gifted that I wanted to use for the pattern. So what did I do? The base yarn that I had was this really wacky wool blend of yarn. It was a worsted spun yarn, but it was only 2-ply, was very, very soft. And so when I ran my finger along it, it would ball up, there would be fibers that would come out of it, and I knew it would have a high likelihood of pilling. I also wasn't quite at the proper gauge with just that one strand. So I knew I had to add something to this. At the time I really wanted something a bit drapier, and I wanted something that had a bit of weight to it. The yarn originally that I had, I felt like it wouldn't hold up because of how it was spun and because of the material itself. Very soft, like I said, and the spin was very loose, even though it was a worsted spun yarn. And the fibers were a little bit shorter than I would have expected. So didn't give me high hopes that it was gonna have any lasting durability to it. So what I added was the opposite of that. I selected a linen and silk wool blend that was worsted spun. Did have a relatively low degree of twist, but because of the silk and linen content in this, I knew that it would add some strength to the fiber that I already had. This was also pretty densely spun, and the fibers themselves were longer than the base material that I had. You might be asking how I knew that. You can just tell the more you look at these yarns. One test that I really like to do when I'm trying to figure out if something's going to be likely to pill or if it's going to be weak and not durable is to run my fingers along it like so when they're slightly wet. And if the yarn is balling up at the end of where my fingers are, then I know that that's probably the degree or the rate that that fiber is going to pill. I also like to do one of these at different lengths, and you can get pretty intense with it and see how strong that fiber really is. Some woolen spun yarns that I've used in the past, they break with no effort at all. And so I know that those are gonna be not as durable typically. The resulting fabric that I got for this was one that met gauge, and it was one that pills almost hardly at all. The contrast of the very fuzzy base that I had and the very dense but strong linen and silk that I added to this really adds both durability but also physical weight, which is why this sweater has so much nice natural drape to it without it being stiff. This sweater doesn't really hold any particular shape, but it's not flimsy because of, the density of the fabric. And that steps into gauge and kind of modification, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. But the material itself is very soft and has a lot of drape to it without just falling off of my body. And so that is how I utilized the knowledge of those fibers and putting them together to put this together. The next sweater that I want to talk about is one I'm most proud of, I think, and that is my Harju sweater. This is a cable design sweater that is supposed to be knit up in an Aran weight fiber. The original yarn that I had for this was a 100% alpaca in DK weight. This yarn is also worsted spun. It is 3-ply, I believe. Doesn't have a huge degree of twist to it. And alpaca typically is a less structured fiber. So alpacas typically will have a higher degree of drape to them, and they can also be very heavy, which accounts for some of the drape. I wasn't going to meet gauge with this original yarn, so I knew I had to bring something else into the mix, and I didn't want to add much weight to the fabric. I also wanted something that was going to have some bounce and spring and shape retention, so I wanted to add structure. So what's the opposite of a worsted spun, kind of very smooth, heavy fabric? For me, it was this. This was a woolen spun sock yarn that had a small nylon percentage in it. This is very lightweight, it's very airy, but because of the nylon content in it, it really adds some strength to the fabric of that cabled sweater without adding a ton of extra weight to the yarn itself. And I think the resulting fabric is very drapey, but not too drapey. And I can't imagine that sweater, honestly, with just alpaca. Like, it just wouldn't have worked. This yarn also, because it's woolen spun, bloomed quite a bit, and and it helped really soften and fill out the stitches in a way that I don't think the alpaca yarn would have done on its own. So I'm really happy that I added this to that because it helped balance some of the qualities of this alpaca yarn with what I had envisioned for wanting the final garment to be. And last but certainly not least is actually what I'm wearing. This is my Oken Vest, and the original yarn that I had for the pattern was a single ply Noro yarn that was a wool base. I think it was a sport weight yarn. It is also a woolen spun yarn. So woolen spun, single ply, low degree of twist. We know that yarns with those properties are going to be not durable. They're going to have a lot of bloom to them and they'll be very light and airy, which is actually quite nice, but they're not going to be very strong. And this yarn actually also, I believe, had a little bit of silk content in it. So it was heavier and drapier than it would be if it was just wool, which was kind of an interesting thing. I had not really used anything like that before. I knew that I wanted to add something that was going to be, again, the exact opposite of that, because I do want some of these elements, but I really wanted to make something that was durable, was going to have a really nice halo to it. I needed to be a little bit bigger gauge, so I knew I had to add something anyway. And I really wanted something that was going to counteract the flimsiness of the base itself. So I went ahead and added a silk mohair. Silk mohair is amazing for adding durability. It decreases the likelihood of your garment pilling. It adds a lot of strength to a fabric without adding a whole lot of weight. And so the result of adding those two things together is I got to retain how light and airy this garment feels. Like, it feels very lightweight, but it also has a nice drape to it because of the silk content and because of the silk mohair that I added. I'm holding this up because I can't find the pink, but it's like the same thing. These are all just a couple of different ways that I have done this, and I will be honest with you, there is a degree of trial and error, but I think if we recap everything that I've talked about, there's a couple general rules that you can use when selecting yarns for your pattern that will help give you a little bit higher degree of success, or at least confidence that you're going to like the final product more. Rule number one, as I stated in the very beginning, is have a vision. Think about the yarn in front of you, whether you need to use that yarn specifically, whether you need to add something to it to counteract a feature of that yarn that you want to decrease. Think about that vision. Identify things that you can name about the fabric that you want. This vest, for example, I was able to say before I even made it, I want it to have drape, but I don't want it to be too heavy. I want it to have structure without being stiff. I want it to have a nice halo and bloom and soften the stitch definition without sacrificing the lightness of the fabric. I knew I wanted it to be soft. I knew I wanted it to be comfortable. I knew I wanted it to be durable. These are all things that helped me narrow down the kind of yarn or thread that I carried with it. If I needed it just to be a bigger gauge and I didn't really want it to have any more drape to it, I could have easily just found a very thin woolen spun single ply yarn to hold with it, and that would have given a totally different effect. It would have just made it meet gauge and probably wouldn't have been super durable, but it would have been very lightweight and airy with less drape than this garment actually has. So having a vision, know what you like, and identify the things about the fabric that you want. Be able to name those things is really helpful. Number two, balance is key. Especially when I'm mixing yarns, I really like to think in opposites. Oftentimes, I'm not using yarns that the pattern is originally designed in, and so I'm having to make yarns that I have just lying around work for that pattern. Oftentimes, the features of those yarns are not exactly what was intended when the original design was made. And so I'm having to add or detract from certain features of my base yarn. My Harju sweater is an excellent example of that. The original pattern was knit in a woolen spun Aran weight wool, just that, nothing held with it. It was lighter in weight It did have pretty good stitch definition. It had a very airy quality to the fabric, making it very, very warm. My base yarn was much denser. It was going to be not as warm because of the density, and I really needed something that was going to counteract that. I needed something that was going to really fill out that stitch, add some airiness, and remove a little bit of the heaviness of that sweater had I just used 100% like densely woven alpaca. So I needed something that was opposite of what the base yarn I had was to bring balance to my fabric. Tip number 3 is try it before you buy it. This is something that I would recommend asking your yarn shop or whoever you're buying yarn from, if it's a local shop, if they care if you do this. I've done this in the past and it's been really helpful, but ask them if you can just buy, 1 or 2 skeins of a couple different things that you want to try for your sweater. See if you can make a gauge, leave the yarn attached, and then just figure out what works for you. Or just buy 1 skein of yarn, try it out, and see what you like more. I think this can help remove some of the pressure that people feel when purchasing yarn. A lot of people I've spoken to, they're like, oh, I bought all this yarn and it's just not quite right, and now I don't know what to do with it. Before you commit to a huge project, especially if you're unsure or not super confident in your selection, I would just ask the seller at your yarn shop, tell them your predicament, and maybe they can just help you. They can help you understand what yarns are going to give the effects and the features of that vision that you have for your garment. Or they might just be willing to let you purchase the yarn and then bring it back if you end up not liking it for your gauge swatch that you do. But just, of course, make sure that you check in with their return policy before making any assumptions about whether or not they'll take something back that you've already bought. Last, and certainly not least, probably most important in my opinion, is to cut yourself some slack, give yourself a break. Knitting is hard. I know that it's kind of something that a lot of people think is very easy, or, oh, it just comes naturally to certain people and not to me. There's a lot that goes into picking something to make fabric with and then making it fit and making the color right and making the material right. There's a lot of different skills that go into that, and it's not something that people are just born with. Some people have just had more exposure and have had more experience and trial and error with doing that very thing. So try not to put too much pressure on yourself or on the outcome being perfect. There's always going to be an element of trial and error. And the best thing about almost all knitting projects is if you don't like it at the very end, you can rip it out and you can frog it and you can use that yarn for something else, because no matter how much we prepare, sometimes there's always projects where sometimes you get to the end, you were super confident that it was going to look great, but then you don't like it and you don't wear it. I definitely have sweaters like that, and I needed to go through making that thing in order to really grasp why it didn't work. Try to enjoy the process just as much as you enjoy the finished garment. You will learn so much, and it's not that stressful. Knitting should be fun, and so much of the stress that I think we feel about our projects and our art, it's all coming from us most of the time. So just give yourself a break. It's a complex thing, and I hope that this has made it a bit more approachable to you. It's definitely still something that I'm learning about, and these are just some of the things that I think about and how I kind of generalize yarns and spins and what effects yarns will give me as a way to help me pick the right yarn for whatever pattern I'm making. I really hope that this was helpful to you all. It was a bit stressful for me putting it together because I really want it to be helpful and I don't want to give any misinformation, but these are all things that I have understood to be true. And again, like I said in the beginning of the video, there are so many amazing artisans and creators that have gone before me and have so much more knowledge. What you're getting here is what I've learned from them and what I've learned from my own experience. So I hope that this made the whole thing a bit more accessible to you, or at least something that feels a bit more like something you can tackle, and you don't need to be so nervous by it. You can always try something and then try something else, and you can always rip it out if you're starting it and not liking it. And hopefully this helps with your selection process. Some of my favorite resources that have just been wonderful. There's actually two I want to mention. The first one is a book, and it is this book. This is Knitting in the Old Way by Priscilla A. Gibson Roberts and Deborah Robson. And this book is exactly what it sounds like. It is all about traditional knitting, all about traditional motifs and traditional knitting techniques. It's not a pattern book, but it is a very classic take and retelling of how you get different effects. And so there's charts in here, there's information about the histories, about how you construct garments and different motifs that you can add to them. It is an older book, but especially in the beginning of the book, they have a really great section on yarn, how you select yarns for your pattern, how you modify things, how you shape sleeves, how you adjust stitches by percentage. Like, it goes into so much depth, and it's just a really wonderful book and one that I highly recommend. Knitting in the Old Way. And then the second resource is one that's here on YouTube. It is Nimble Needles. I'm sure most of you have heard of him, but he is a knitter based out of Norway, I believe. All of his content is incredible. He has a very successful YouTube channel that's all about knitting techniques, how-tos, and he goes into so much depth. He truly just makes amazing things, and he explains all of these techniques and is really just someone who is so knowledgeable about the nitty-gritty of the how-tos. So much more knowledgeable than I am. I can only aspire to be as knowledgeable and experienced as he is someday. Definitely would recommend him out if you're looking for some video or visual learning content. And then the book is just a really great, different way of getting a lot of that same information. That is it for this week's episode. Like I said, stay tuned for coming weeks. I'm going to be talking about color and modification and how I tackle those two categories of setting myself up for success with all my knitted garments. I truly appreciate if you made it to the end sitting through with me and listening to me talk about this. I really hope it was helpful for you and gave you some clarity, understanding, and a bit of ease about picking the yarns that you want for your pattern. I think that they're things that I really love kind of nerding out about and learning and experiencing for myself. They've really helped me be more confident in the things that I'm making. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you're all getting to knit and make all the things that you want to make and that you're finding joy in all of it. Stay classy. Bye.